I'm Dan Willis. I wrote for Dragonlance for Wizards of the Coast for years, and I will be releasing a fantasy noir detective series called The Arcane Casebook next month.
I'm Modesitt, and I've written a few books along the way, and I'm at Bard's Tower most of the time when I'm not doing panels.
Okay, when he says a few, I just asked him, 73 up to date. I'm Adrienne Monson. I write paranormal romance, retold fairy tales, and dystopian.
I'm Jonathan Maberry. I write novels, comics, bunch of other stuff. One of my series, V Wars, is now in production as a Netflix TV series, which will launch in March, starring Ian Somerhalder. And I am having fun playing in the swimming in the sea of weird. So.
My name is Swedin. I'm a professor of history at Weber State University. I have 11 books out, 5 of which are novels. My main claim to fame was one of my books won the Sidewise Award for the Best Alternate History Book of the Year.
Hi, they just added me to this panel. My name is Jai Nitz. I'm a comic book writer from Kansas City. I'm one of the guests, and I write comic books. I write Suicide Squad at DC, and my own creator on stuff. So thanks for having me out in Salt Lake. It's amazing to be here.
Nice to have you. Okay, so, the first thing that I'd like to ask everybody, what is the, of any weakness or things you've seen in a hero, what would you say is your favorite? If something that influenced you most, that you found is very poignant in the story. Dr. Dan.
So we got a comic book writer. I want to jump to comics for a second. One of the most interesting weaknesses I ever saw in a character was back from the 80s or 90s Teen Titans books. They had a character on there, Kid Flash, and he could use his powers, but every time he did, he was killing himself. He was exposing him to radiation. And so every time he went out to be a superhero, he had to grapple with, do I really want to do this? And I found it very compelling. Of course, the writing was really good. That helps.
I guess, I don't know, I'd have to take it from one of my own books, which was The Magic of Recluse. And Laris's principal weakness is he's bored. As many teenagers are, he's bored. And the boredom is what gets him into everything.
I'm going to go a little different and say Sherlock Holmes. He's a really strong character that everybody loves, and he is riddled with weaknesses. His, social awkwardness is just one of my favorite character weaknesses I've seen in a strong character like that.
One of my favorite characters, who has a lot of damages carrying around, is Dave Robichaux from the James Lee Burke novels, who is a recovering alcoholic who has rage issues and is very frustrated with the politics of Louisiana and dealing with corruption. And as a cop, he's trying to fix, and it never seems to get fixed. And he's balancing his addictions and his rage with his need to try to make order out of the world, and knows he's failing even though he may solve cases.
I would say that the Thomas Covenant novels, which was a fantasy trilogy back in the late 70s, where he is really having a difficult time coming to accept that everything that's happening to him is real, and he does some particularly bad things because of that lack of acceptance. So I found that very interesting. From my own work, one of my characters, I remember the format was a mystery, and his adopted brother had been murdered, and I just made my character continuously angry, and that is an understandable reaction, but it also made that character into a real person for me, and it motivated him to do things, and some of the best scenes came out of that anger, because anger by and large is debilitating and makes you make bad decisions, and sometimes you want your characters to be subject to bad decisions.
I'm just going to throw a riff on what Eric said, and that is that for better or worse, I've noticed a trend in fiction over the last few years. There are a tremendous number of angry characters. Far more, no, I've probably got the longest history in the field here, and I think I can say that the percentage of weaknesses among heroes being anger has increased with every decade that I've been writing. Just an observation.
I think the best serialized fiction since Dickens was The Wire by David Simon, and every cop in Baltimore in that show is deeply flawed one way or another. And the lead character, Jimmy McNulty, is an alcoholic womanizer. He would be the best cop in the world if he wasn't an alcoholic womanizer. Like she said about Sherlock Holmes, it's, you know, I mean, when Doyle's writing, he's obviously a cocaine addict, you know, not kind of, like very much so. So there's things like that. And today, if I said, hey, this is the guy who's going to solve the murder, and he's a cocaine addict, you guys would all be like, I don't think so. Like, but then in my own stuff, on Suicide Squad, I created El Diablo from the film, and El Diablo's powers made a bad guy do the right things, and that was something that was, it just turned the flaw upside down, is that in his society, being a bad guy is actually a real job choice. And in our society, if you met a guy who was a drug lord, you'd be like, no thanks, but in his world, that was an acceptable job pursual, like a doctor. So then when he gets powers that make him do the right thing, it turns that world upside down. So that was something that was really easy to write. Like, I mean, that just, I was saying, it just makes it, the stories fall out of you when you have a thing that is a hook that you can't get enough of when you as a writer can't get enough of the end game. Like, you keep going, you're like, ooh, what if they did this, and what if they did this? When you were asking what if, then you're just fine in your computer. So.
Okay, and for me, I don't know that I've really connected to all that much. I did find that one that may not have been perceived as a weakness is in the R.A. Salvatore's Driz, his unwillingness to kill his own people for a while. It really hampered him in certain situations. And just the unwillingness to change perspective really.
Having a code.
Yeah, having a code that sometimes the code can hurt you rather than help you in some ways. And so.
I'll add one last one. Superman's unwillingness to kill people is unbelievably annoying.
Batman's too.
Yeah.
It becomes, you realize that, you know, this whole story would have been over way back there if you just whacked the person that needed to be whacked. I mean, if Lex Luthor had just struck him, that would have been the end of it. Now, we like to think that people who are not going to kill people are of higher moral value in some way, but they are action comics. I mean, they are there to have fights and everything, and they don't even seem to do it accidentally. And I think that people who engage in that type of activity would often do it accidentally.
Actually, I think you could expand on what was said there in the sense that morality in general, if it's too strict, can be a tremendous weakness. I know that's probably heresy, but it is, in effect, a way which restricts, for social good, one's actions, and any restriction is a weakness.
Well, I mean, that's the dichotomy between someone like Batman and a soldier. A soldier has to kill in order to protect those who can't fight for themselves. Batman is at war in Gotham City, and he's not killing the enemy who is in fact relentlessly killing the innocent. I always found the character to be complicit in those murders because he's not taking the choice that is the necessary choice to protect Gotham from a relentless enemy. And a soldier would, a cop would if he had to. It always annoys me when a hero stands on the moral high ground while letting other people die because of that narrow view he has of what's right.
Yeah. One way of thinking about morality is, if you have the power to stop something, you may not have been the one that did it, but the fact that you didn't use your power to stop something that was bad makes you partially morally complicit in that.
Yeah, it's a lot of times thinking what are the short-term and long-term consequences. But it's like, yeah, you kill this guy and you're going to feel bad, and some people might hate you for it. But if you don't, 1,000 other people are going to die. what is worse?
One of the things I've always hated in comics, TV, movies, somebody's about to kill the bad guy, and somebody else will say, no, maybe you're going to be just like him. No, you're freaking not. No.
Pulling the trigger can be righteous.
So have you ever had a hard time writing weaknesses into a character? Like when you're writing a character, you want the character for everything to go good. Have you ever had a hard time going, looked at the character and go, there's nothing wrong with this and people aren't going to connect?
So Spider-Man is actually all of us. He's a very nerdy kid who has trouble with, relationships, has trouble paying rent, and he feels responsible for the death of his uncle, so he has very much feet of clay. It's really hard to dislike Peter Parker. Like, it's really hard to not like him. But then when you say, but you then have all these powers, but we understand, where great power comes, with great power comes great responsibility. We understand that because we are all nerdy Peter Parkers in our own way. But now we all know that being a nerd isn't as bad as it used to be. Like, that now if you were a kid who was into photography and you were really smart and you were going to get into MIT, you would not have a problem with people liking you. That wouldn't be, people would be like, I don't like that guy. He's really smart and into cool nerd stuff. No, that wouldn't be the problem anymore. So it's really hard to keep.
I don't know what world you're in.
Well, that's the thing is, the world that I'm in is that I teach at the University of Kansas, and those kids who are nerds, they rule the world. They are. It is completely different than when I was in high school. Completely different. But that's the thing is, that's why it doesn't ring as true to me anymore. So I hate kicking Peter Parker down a flight of stairs because he doesn't really deserve it. Because he's us. But that's why it's writing a jerk who's very flawed and then kicking them down a flight of stairs and making the world go upside down for them. That's easy. Everyone likes to see a jerk get theirs. So it's fun to write jerks getting theirs. And then maybe if they become good people by the end of the story, you've done your job. But
I think it's not necessarily difficult to write flaws in a character. I think the trick is that balance between the flaws and the endearing qualities to make them still likable. If you have too hard of a weakness, your readers are not going to care about the character. They're like, you're just being an idiot at this point. Batman, what is wrong with you? Those kinds of moments. So that's to me really what it comes down to, is that perfect balance where you still have those enduring qualities that the readers are going to love the character, even though they have these weaknesses and make mistakes.
Okay, I'm going to throw a little technical angle into this. Part of how weaknesses are portrayed and the line between acceptable or unacceptable or what have you depends, as a novelist at least, how you portray that particular character. Some of you may have read The Magic of Recluse. Laris is a bored, slightly ADD young man. Not that the society has any word for that. If I had written that book in the third person rather than the first person, nobody would have gotten past the first 20 pages because he would have come off as this bored, shallow, self-centered individual. He's not. He's ADD. By telling it from his point of view, you realize that there's more there. The weakness is still there, but if it had been done in the third person, some people even did put down the book in the first person. I can't believe what it might have been if I'd written in the third person. So how you present those weaknesses is much a factor as what those weaknesses are.
Yeah, I find it much easier to write a flawed character. I've never met a flawless person. I've met people with various levels of flaws, and that always fascinates me. But when I'm writing a character, if I'm creating like my Joe Ledger character, my Thriller series, psychologically speaking, he's a bag of hamsters. I mean, this guy's nuts. He's got all sorts of issues from childhood trauma. He's got this, he and his girlfriend were attacked by older teens when they were younger. He was beaten nearly to death, and his girlfriend was savagely raped. He did not recover from that. He was fractured by it. And so there's no way in which any action he takes in a crisis situation is not going to be filtered through that. So, you know, he gets into martial arts, he joins the military, he becomes a cop, and later on becomes a special operator because he's still trying to fight that same fight he lost. He's damaged goods, and that's what makes him interesting to write about. You know, I have the 10th book in that series coming out, and I haven't begun to scratch the surface of all the possible damage, because not only does he carry the damage from his childhood, he gets messed up by each book. Everything he does, you know, there's an old saying in psychology that violence always leaves a mark. Well, absolutely. So it's fun to continue exploring his psychological disintegration, because there may be a point where he has gone so far out on the edge that he becomes a danger to his own need to help. And that's fun to explore. So I love playing or starting with the psychological damage of a character and wrapping the story around that, rather than starting, say, with a high concept and then trying to input the characters.
I was just thinking of an experience I had with an editor. I was writing a thriller, science fiction, near future thriller, and I was working with an editor at the time at one of the big houses, and I decided I wanted to add an extra flaw to this archaeologist. He's a middle-aged archaeologist, former military background. So he had an STD, and she unloaded. I mean, the editor. There was no way that was going to be part of the character, because that. In the conversation I had with her, quite frankly, I decided that she had actually knew someone in her personal life that had an STD, an incurable STD, and that made the story too real for her, I think, in many ways. And it's one of those things like STDs, which are unbelievably pervasive in our society, are completely forbidden in media and books. I mean, it's unbelievably rare to have a character that actually has an STD. And,
completely verboten to have a hero have that happen.
right, because what it does is then you actually have to think about, well, but life's not supposed to be that savage. They were just enjoying themselves. My book I do called Dream Thief at Dark Horse, the first page of the first issue, the lead character wakes up in the bed of a girl who's not his girlfriend. And he later shoots a guy in the neck twice and takes his head clean off in another issue. No one said anything about violence, but man, fanboys were they were clutching their pearls that he would cheat on his girlfriend. Oh my goodness, what have you done? And I'm like, have you ever had a girlfriend? Like, because a lot of people cheat on them, and a lot of girlfriends cheat on boyfriends. It's just, like I said, it's something that happens in our society, and it's something that happens all the time in adult fare on TV, books, movies. That's something that happened in comic books. That was too adult a concept to grasp for people who wanted escapist, brightly colored people beating the crap out of each other. Like, they did not want someone doing that. But he didn't get an STD from this.
He didn't, and if he had, it would have been a layer that would have been beyond the pale. You know, being too much for everyone.
I think that those examples, though, come down to something, like, you want to make sure whatever weaknesses you have, it's something that your readers can relate to still. And I'm not saying you can't have a character with an STD. I think you certainly can. And there are plenty of characters that cheat on their spouses or partners or whatnot. But make sure it's presented in a way that is still relatable, so that the reader or the viewer can still have a relationship with that character.
Agreed.
Of course, relationship doesn't mean they like them. There's some characters that people read about that they love to hate.
I have many villains that I love to hate.
So, with weaknesses, how important do you think it is that they're intertwined into the story? Like, when do you turn a weakness into a strength? When does it become appropriate to, in the character arc, to actually change it into a strength?
I think that's kind of core to a lot of the stories. I wrote the Black Panther comic for a couple of years.
Yes,
and
you did. It's very good.
Yeah, thanks. I got onto the book right after Reggie Hudlin, and he had T'Challa injured. So Shuri, his sister, had to take over. Now, in the movie, Shuri is a brilliant scientist. In the comic, she was pretty much the Lindsay Lohan of Wakanda. She was a party girl, she was not a brilliant scientist, but when I took over the story, she had to change from who she'd been to become the hero of her people and the leader of her people. And that was a challenge because the previous writers had spent a lot of time making her a mess. And I appreciated being handed a mess.
Yeah.
Because it gave me an arc. If the character's already AJ squared away, there's nowhere to go unless you then crash them and rebuild them. But I already was starting with a car crash of a character. So I got a chance to rebuild her, and she was by no means stepping into the uniform of the Panther and becoming immediately a hero. She lost her first couple of fights. She was not that good at her job. She had good people around her and eventually rose to become a heroic character. But it was fun taking, over the course of my arc, taking that character and building her up. And at the same time working with T'Challa, who no longer had his powers because he's no longer the Panther, and him having to go outside of his normal, he was very much into straight science. He's the scientist in the comics, not Shuri. Go outside his science and pursue something like alchemy, and aligning himself with a character from Wakanda who he's hated all this time, the sorcerer, and trying to recapture that because he feels disempowered. So both characters were damaged when I got them, and I had a great time using that as the core of the story to rebuild them, and also the way in which their damage impacted negatively the Wakandan culture, and then working to rebuild that. So having that as a starting point in a story gives you so much to play with, gives you so much creative juice.
And fine job.
Oh, thank you.
That's the funnest part, actually, is having a character that has so many flaws, that there's so much growth that can happen with the character arc, that, I mean, you want to have a character that has, I think that's part of the reasons why villains are so big these days, is because they've been so flawed, and now they want backstory of, like, why are they this person? And now they're turning into an anti-hero instead of, just being a one-dimensional villain. To answer your question as far as character arc, though, I feel like as long as it's organic and it continues to keep the story moving forward, I really get so frustrated when it feels like they're continuing to put roadblocks in front of a character to not make them grow, and it doesn't feel organic. Something that comes to mind is like the Lois and Clark series. I don't know if you guys saw that, but it was like, okay, come on, Lois is not that stupid, but you are making her a moron because she's not understanding who, Clark Kent really is. It didn't feel organic to me after, like, I don't know, the 5th season or something.
Shocking.
Shocking, right?
Yeah.
What about the idea that someone's flaws is that they have no flaws?
I think that makes them too unlikable, but then they become unlikable.
Well, but that's, I guess, what I'm driving at.
Yeah.
I mean,
And they're not relatable.
Yeah. Like what you were just saying about relating to villains so much is that I see more people cosplaying as Loki than I do cosplaying as Superman now. And it's kind of what we were saying earlier, is Superman is this unattainable ideal that we don't connect to very well anymore. But Loki is an extremely attainable ideal that we all connect to.
Yeah, you see more Jokers than Batman walking around
Right.
too.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now that actually bothers me more than Loki. But that's the thing, is that I think that well, for those of you anybody here watch Rick and Morty, I mean,
Yep.
Rick is a villain. Rick is a straight up villain that is running a show, and anybody who says that's my favorite character in literature right now, you're like, that person is a sociopath, because Rick is a problem. But it's very, very well done. It's compellingly done. So Rick and Morty is very watchable, but Rick is a villain. And by the flip of that is, Homer is a flat-out hero in The Simpsons. Homer is a flat-out hero. He is a deeply flawed hero that we all root for one way or another, but he is a straight-up hero. And so if someone says, I love Homer Simpson, you should hug that person, because Homer Simpson is the kind of hero that we all really are, right? So.
I would say the thing that makes Loki interesting is because he's the trickster, he's compelled to be the trickster. He is compelled never to develop.
Right.
Even though everyone's more like, oh, did he learn anything from that? And you almost have hope for a moment, but no, he doesn't.
Frog and the Scorpion, like he's gonna sting you. It just
Yeah.
you don't know how far you're gonna be into the river.
He is the trickster.
Yeah.
That's the problem I usually have with writing flawed characters, is the difference between writing a single book and writing a series. In a single book, your hero or protagonist's flaw is the thing they have to overcome in order to win.
Right.
If you have, this is what happens when you get a movie and the movie was really good, and so they say, hey, let's make a new one, a sequel, even though it was not set up for a sequel. And the very first thing they do is take whatever the relationship was that they established, or whatever the hero had to do to overcome his flaw, they break that immediately in the first scene of the next film. The reason they do that is because they have to, because now the character doesn't have any flaws.
Yeah, that's what Deadpool 2 was.
Yeah, and when you...
Deadpool was the overcome the relationships. Then Deadpool 2, they start off, spoiler alert, ruining his relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And you should talk with Sherlock Holmes is a great example of a character whose flaw he doesn't, because usually in the ongoing series, the detective novel especially, the detective's flaws aren't, the mystery is what compels the detective to move through the story. You don't have that character journey going on. They're kind of the same person in the end that they were in the beginning. In fact, you go read the old pulp novels, it's almost the same scene of them sitting in the dark drinking in the beginning and the end. Because they don't change, it's everything else that changes. But that's the problem I usually run into is when I'm writing a series. It's like, okay, how do I fill this character with enough gas to get to the finish line? Because if he's got to overcome some flaw in the first book to get to the end of that, where do we go from there? And a lot of times the way you end up doing that is to change off characters. Change off main characters, or change off viewpoint, add a new viewpoint character who's got a flaw that you can then deal with.
Yeah, and it's interesting with the Punisher character in Marvel. He's a one-note character. I mean, he is basically that one flaw, and that's become who he is. So when writing Punisher stories, any of us who have done those, we've had to create flawed and complex supporting characters for the story to be interesting. Because this is a dictate from Marvel, by the way. Because I wrote a Marvel story where he goes through some psychological changes, and they're like, no, you cannot change the Punisher. I'm like, really? Not at all? Like, no, not at all. So we had to mess with all the characters around him. In the show, they're doing a little more work with his psychological development. But if that show were to run for any length of time, they're going to run into the problem with that character then hitting that level of killer. And they're going to have to focus entirely on the supporting characters and make them, mess them up and explore their damage.
And what he just said is a big problem that I have as a comic book person is that for writing Suicide Squad, Deadshot has been around since 1950. So I am working with someone else's character. But everybody up here, we all create our own stuff too. You create your own stuff, you can do whatever you want. But when you get in the sandbox of a major company, whether it's Warner Brothers or Disney, and you say, I just wrote Coco and Frozen, both for Disney. Coco, I'm Mexican, I was given full reign to do whatever I wanted to do. But Frozen, they were like, you cannot do anything different with these characters, don't touch a thing. And it was the hardest writing job I've ever done because the sandbox was so specific. And like you're saying, Marvel or DC, you can't make Batman start killing people, you can't make, the Punisher gay, you can't do any of that stuff, you can't make any changes across the board. But if you did, you could do with your own thing all day long. And that's the beauty of most of us working, is we can do with our own thing all day long.
List that I had to do with the old Wizards of the Coast Dragonlance break.
Yeah.
That's the same thing. That's just a verbal comic book.
Yeah.
Well, going back to John's comment about the Punisher and how all the characters around him had to change, kind of reminds me of what the comment of what Lee brought up. What if you have a character that doesn't have flaws? And there are stories that are like that, like Back to the Future. Marty McFly is the main character of that story, but if you think about it, he really doesn't have a character arc. His flaws are more external, of like his family and his circumstance, and those things do change throughout the story by the end. So I guess it is possible to have a character, but you have to make up for it with all the outside characters and all the things that are going on. There still has to be a really good arc and some obstacles.
I don't know, his flaw was that he didn't care. And he didn't care, he got into trouble, and then he had to care.
Well, I just rewatched it with my kids the other day, and the thing he cares the most about is getting the truck to go up to go camping with Jennifer. That's all he cares about.
He got that at the end.
Right. All he really cares about is kick off the entire story is getting late. That's the only thing he cares about at all. And then because he cares about music, but he doesn't. That doesn't really.
He's not dedicated.
He's not dedicated. There's no arc to that. It's
right.
What he cared about was and like you said, everything's external.
His dad, I think, had the biggest arc.
Sure, absolutely. He's the one who changes.
Yeah.
And my kids were much more interested in Doc Brown
the night
Oh,
before.
sure.
That's true, his
Yeah.
dad is the one that overcomes his flaw.
Yeah, his dad is the one who changes completely. Yeah.
I would say also, the three movies, he's trying to solve other people's problems, you know?
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
But that's, in a sense, that's a flaw too.
Yes.
I mean, when you're compelled to solve everybody else's problems, is that because you don't want to face your own? Or is that because you're avoiding your own destiny?
Well, I would say the one thing that sticks out to me as one of the only flaws in that is his pride when people call him a coward.
Coward, yeah. But that
Right,
doesn't,
yeah.
that doesn't happen until the second movie.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen at all in the first movie.
Right.
What you were saying earlier about they have
They
to
had to
create
create a flaw
create
for
a
the
flaw.
sequel.
Yeah. When I remember when that happened, I remember it stuck out to me. I'm like, why does he care about this? Because he never cared about it before. Also, Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers is yelling at him, so that's even weirder. So everything about that moment was me going, I don't get it. I don't get a big damn.
It kind of came out of the blue.
Yeah.
I thought it was a flaw to make the plot go in a way that wasn't going to be natural from the character's reactions.
Sure, but it wasn't organic because it wasn't introduced in the very first movie.
Right, and they did use it to make a joke. That's the whole point.
And I'm sure that the houses they all built with the money they made from that sequel was very inorganic. Very happy with
You
that.
make a lovely point there.
Yeah, exactly.
So when does it become appropriate to turn a strength into a weakness?
As soon as it serves the story.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, before it serves the story.
I stand corrected.
Because otherwise it becomes mechanical. It's
Right.
like, oh, they just did that there.
Right.
You have to introduce the weakness before it's apparent that this is going to affect anything.
Or at least the temptation of it. Like,
Yeah.
the temptation of any weakness, is you have to introduce that at a time that the character can say no to it. So then later when they don't say no to it, it makes sense.
Yeah, the author of historical novels, Bernard Cornwell, did a pretty interesting work with that in his Richard Sharp novels.
Yeah, sure.
Because Sharp starts off as an ambitious guy up from the ranks to officer rank, and he's trying to control his men from being too savage. And then there's one book in which he completely loses his shit and goes completely savage, killing someone who doesn't need to be killed. His ambition derails him and makes him do stupid choices in which people die. So with each book, Cornwell took those qualities that made him the hero in the first place and began to erode him. Now later on, as the series went into like 18 or 19 volumes, he kind of shifted away from messing with Sharp as much. But in the middle books, he was really taking the strengths that he built into Sharp and showing them to be liabilities depending on how the character reacted to different things. I thought it was really well done, very well played.
Well,
Actually,
that's an
I think
interesting-
that happened with Mission Impossible. Ethan Hunt is getting a little boring to me. I kind of want to see him actually turn against the government.
Yeah, let him actually become the bad agent that he thinks he's been.
Yeah.
But you brought up an interesting point, Jonathan, about the fact that I think this is something that's often overlooked, that a series of traits at one level or one performance level which make you successful can become liabilities when you move to a different level or a different place or a different set of responsibilities. And the question is, for a character, can that character change, or does the change, does the Peter principle, in essence, get to you?
Yeah. I think that's the Peter principle is the problem with ongoing series that go, no matter how long they go, that once they get past the original nugget that you had, you have advanced a character beyond what makes them relatable or interesting either one. And I think that we've all seen that. And one of my music critic friends, he said it's a good thing Jimi Hendrix died at 27 after 3 albums, because his 4th album would have been just a nightmare. It would have been him doing jazz interpretations of guitar songs, because the guy was so far beyond what everybody was, what everyone else was capable of, that he could not have stayed inside the picture that we understood. So his liquid would have flown, all over the table. And he said, but he didn't, because of the constraint of death. That made it to where he only made 3 perfect albums, and we all will love Jimi Hendrix forever. And I think that it's the same thing that happened to
I mean, all of us have had this one way or another, but obviously with Holmes, it was the biggest thing, is that, you know, they were like, I'm tired of writing this guy, I'm gonna have him die, you know, protecting the world from the main bad guy. And the fans rioted, they rioted that the hero died, and, you know, you had to bring him back, and also you had to pay bills. So
Yeah.
That's why I had to bring it back, I was gonna say.
And in a long series, real long series, there is a danger for the character to become just the same flavor. Much as I love the early Spencer novels by Robert B. Parker, after a while it was straight rinse and repeat, because you can tell that the author lost his interest in the character and was writing because those are the books that sold 2 million copies, but if he wrote another series, they would sell, you know, a fifth as many. So it became rinse and repeat. He gave the character no growth potential. Early on, he messed with his relationships and with his health and a bunch of other things that he just simply abandoned as it went on. And that disturbs me, you know, as somebody who's now about to write the 11th novel in a series. You know, I have to be really cautious not to fall into that trap. And I'm looking for ways in which I can really mess with my character's peace of mind as much as possible.
Well, I can give you a way to do it, which I don't see being done too much, probably because it's suicidal. But what if your hero turns into the villain and somebody else takes over as a hero? That was a question I was going to raise a minute ago. There is a character arc there. Does the hero always have to stay a hero? Does the villain always have to stay a villain? I don't see many changes. You often see villains who change into something better, but we don't see often heroes destroy themselves, so to speak.
Yeah, the first Mission Impossible film, they did that. The hero from the original series became the villain of the first movie.
Right.
And I think they should have done more with that. I'd like to have seen him become the ongoing villain. Because
That's part of why I'm like, let's make Ethan Hunt
I would-
follow those same
if you could
footsteps.
convince Tom
you know?
Cruise to play a villain, that'd be great.
I think it'd be awesome.
Yeah, it was called Tropic Thunder, and it was. But like in real life, Orson Welles was that. Orson Welles was the hero of his own story to begin with, and at 25 he made Citizen Kane, right? And by the end of his life, everyone hated him. He was scurrying around trying to make any movie happen, and he told Bogdanovich that, oh, they'll love me when I'm dead. When I'm dead, they won't see the flawed man in front of them anymore. They'll only remember the hero I was when I was younger.
Yeah.
And now we're about to see a release of his last film, you know, in theaters and on Netflix, and by the end of this year, and that's going to be an amazing, amazing meta commentary on Wells. Is that there's going to be people who hate it, there's going to be people who love it, and there's going to be discussion about it like there was about his entire life. But he's dead, so he doesn't get his voice, which is the saddest part, because Orson Welles was the best voice of Orson Welles. Like him talking about himself was like that was the most captivating thing possible.
Yeah, and also to Lee's point, they do in comics a lot where Batman will become corrupt for a second, or Superman will become Dark Superman, or they'll play some version of it where the hero becomes the villain. They did it with Captain America in Marvel,
Right.
And as a result, Marvel's market share went down 15% for the print comics.
Right.
Well, that was basically what I was
When he
saying.
said suicidal, he meant it. Yeah.
Yeah. It is.
But that's the thing is like
But it's tempting as a writer to want to play with that.
It
Sure.
is.
Well, that was the whole death of Superman thing when Superman died, and then Superman came back like within 18 months. Like people, duh. But Mike Carl was the editor of the Superman comic at the time. People said, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? And then they got all these new characters out of it. And then the end, when Superman returned, everyone's like, oh, we've got Superman back. And he goes, yeah, but you didn't think that before we started this story. That before the story, you were really bored with Superman. You thought Superman was really dull. You thought he was corn pone. You thought he was some old, apple pie crap from Kansas. That's me. And but then when I killed him and brought him back with really good creators, now you're like, oh, we have Superman back, and you got to rejuvenate that character that way. And so there is marketing to be done as well.
Marketing, yes.
Yeah.
So Jonathan mentioned the Bernard Cornwell novels, and there's not other than the romance genres, there's not a lot of historical fiction being done today, but he's a real giant of it. In his Saxon Tales, it's really apparent the way he cheats as a writer, and I'm very impressed by it. And that is, the way he cheats is he wants this character to be a borderline barbarian / Viking and behave with the morality and the way that those type of people would have behaved. So he wants to be authentic, but he doesn't want to alienate his reader. So what he does is he's kind of downplays it when he goes off and just murders people. And in other times, he makes whoever he's fighting so much worse that you continue to root for the main character. And in that sense, he gets his cake and gets to eat it too, in the sense that he is authentic to being a genuine historical novelist, which is people behave differently in the past than they do in the present, and had different moralities and different ways of functioning. But he still appeals enough to the audience that he sells books. And in a way, this is sort of like the distinction that's often made in novels between that's a writer's novel versus a reader's novel. And people who are writers often look for things and treasure things in novels that the vast number of readers will not. And so you hear things like, that's a writer's writer. That means he's mostly unemployed.
Yeah. Okay. So, we've got a few minutes for questions. If anybody would like to come up and ask.
It's been a really interesting panel, thank you. We've definitely seen, as was alluded to, an observable trend of kind of a shift from the storytelling of yesterday with more conventional and archetypal good guys and archetypal bad guys into this realm now of much more sympathetic villains and much more flawed protagonists. And I wonder if you think that's more just the evolution of storytelling trends, or if it speaks to broader cultural and societal evolution.
Attention. There is very rarely a black and white in terms of psychological makeup. You know, everyone is complex. Hannibal Lecter is very interesting character. He's not a good guy by any stretch, but he's charismatic, and he's manipulative, and he has all these different dimensions to him. Which make him appealing. So much so that at the end of the book, he's actually going to kill someone who is not actually a villain, and we're rooting for him to do so. You know, the warden. We see good and bad in a lot of people, and that is true across the board. There are very few people I've ever met who are completely good or completely bad. It used to be that we were afraid to show those flaws because of people. You know, in the World War II era, you wanted your heroes to be spotless Christian heroes. I mean, that was boom, you're a good guy. After the comics code thing, they didn't even allow writers to do flaws. In this era, we find that flaws are where we're relating to the readers. They're not looking for perfect. They're looking for complex and realistic. So I think it's writers observing the real world and trying to reflect that in the writing that is informing all of this now.
I also think it's just the natural evolution of readers and viewers. You know, we always want to progress. You can't just stay stagnant in anything in life. And so you read books that are at a certain level, and then as you grow, you want more and more in depth, more complex, things like that. And I think just as we have grown as readers with media, there's a lot more genres and subgenres than there used to be. There's a reason why we want to have more growth. We want a little bit more so we can continue to progress in our reading.
You're speaking like a writer's writer, though. No, I think what we're seeing is a broadening of the readership base. There's a different level. There are still people out there who want the simplistic or more simple good characters and the straightforward values, but there are also people who want the depth. And I think this is one of the reasons why the entire market has fragmented and become much more niche oriented. You're talking about, all of you that have just mentioned this, you're talking about, should we say, the brighter, more intellectual, more discerning people. But there's a range of people. All people aren't like that. And I think it's a mistake to forget that. And I'll admit, I write for exactly the people they're talking about. But I also have had enough critique about the fact that, why is it so complicated for other people?
There's I was going to agree with what Lee said in 1 second.
Okay.
If there's a trend away from the good versus evil story, then you ought to start writing that, because that means there's a market that's not being filled. Get on the business side to that writing.
So you kind of answered my first question with that last one, so I had to think of another one. But one of my favorite, like back to the topics of characters flipping their polarities, basically. One of my favorite books did have a secondary hero become the main villain, and the main villain becoming the new mentor character. And that completely changed my writing style to where the hero really has the highest body count out of anybody in my book. Because to me, that evil is so compelling. What are some stories you guys have read or personal experiences that really changed how you viewed what makes a weakness evil versus just really heavily flawed?
The Music Man. The Music Man is like, there's the argument, there's two different kinds of stories, that it's, the hero goes out on a quest and a stranger comes to town. They're the same story from different perspectives. That was the thing that totally blew my mind, is that the Music Man is, the hero goes out on a quest. He's not a hero, he's actually a villain, but he comes to a town, and the townspeople all have to react to that hero coming to them, as opposed to some guy with a lightsaber running into your planet and cutting down a bunch of, the people that just live there, right? They're the same thing from different perspectives. When somebody brought that up and I rewatched The Music Man, I was like, look, it's this weird villainous tale, but then it's also this super heroic, endearing tale for townspeople. So yeah, that when you watch polarities flip like that, and obviously the characters change by the end because it's only 2 hours and they, that's all they have to do. That was super enlightening to me as a writer to watch that.
It's just been mentioned a couple times that writing it so that the main hero ends up being the villain would be sort of literary suicide for the book and for whatever franchise could be. I'm just wondering, what would be the best way to go about not killing yourself with that? Like, to make it so that it would be more palatable or engaging in a way that's not going to turn off readers.
Well, it all depends on the structure of what you're going to do in terms of a series. I frankly avoid that because in the Recluse books, there are 21 books in the series, which sounds like this overwhelming length. But I've never written more than 2 books about a given set of characters. Basically, it's set in a world and a system which draws back in other readers so that each set is new and by itself. I think you've got a real problem. I mean, my head goes off to writing 11 books about the same character and trying to keep that psychologically. I don't think I could do that. But that's one way of doing it and still stay in the same universe.
I think it's, if you can set the proper expectation, which doesn't mean to say you don't have to start at the book saying this person's going to end up the villain, but put those little hints throughout the book so readers can say, ooh, what if? So you're setting up the expectation for the readers so they can kind of make those mental leaps to when the character does have that shift. I think it's a lot easier for them to be able to swallow that because they can really see the progression of that journey and go back and connect all those dots and like, yes, this is what this and this and this and this meant.
Well, I'm going to go back and answer this. I actually did what you're talking about in the Recluse books. I told one book from the viewpoint of the main character on one side, and he was the hero. I told two books from the side with the main guy who was on the opposition. They were both heroes in one set of books, and they were both villains in the other set of books, and I didn't change the circumstances in the slightest.
Nice.
It can be done, is what they're saying.
Yes.
How important is it, or is it possible to have heroes with flaws that don't affect the story at all? They don't have to overcome their flaws. They're just flaws that give the character dimension.
Well, I mean, we all have that to a degree, but if a flaw doesn't play into the story,
Why are you bringing it up?
yeah, it's interesting, but it's not something I would spend a whole lot of time on. I did a standalone novel about a woman overcoming addiction. She's clean after being an addict for years and looking for her lost child. And the addiction isn't, overcoming addiction is not the point of the story. The fact that she was an addict informs every part of it. So, I don't really spend a lot of time with her at NA meetings, or overcoming that. But it does play in, it informs the decision she's going to make, and it also informs her confidence about her own decision-making abilities, because she was damaged goods for a long time and damaged in her own eyes and doesn't trust herself. So I don't know that I would build in a major character flaw without it informing some part of it. It may not affect the plot or the problem that the character is trying to solve, but it may affect the way in which that character would solve any problem, or just get through their lives to show that they may be ill-prepared for the challenges ahead of them, and therefore the uphill climb becomes part of the story.
Kurt Vonnegut once said that everybody on the page should want something, even if it's just a glass of water. If you're gonna spend words on it, make it worthwhile.
This will have to be the last question.
Yeah, this will have to be, we're pretty much out of time, so.
Just have a quick question. We talked about, or you talked about how a character, once they're in their one element and they've overcome that flaw, that the next time they come back for a sequel or another book, they kind of have to reset that flaw. Is there a way, or have you experimented with a way to have the flaw, but not necessarily they overcome the flaw entirely, but
Well, that's,
Maybe
just
it's-
bringing up that example as they weren't planning on a sequel when they had that for the sequel, the character flaw they introduced in the second book or movie or whatever.
Okay,
If you're planning a sequel, build it in.
I was going to say, even if you're not planning a sequel, build in those possibilities. Because you never know what's going to happen. You can have a character with a couple of flaws. They solve the major flaw. All right, that shifts the emphasis on the character the second time around. What was only a minor flaw becomes a major flaw because of the change in his or her personality.
And that's just good character anyway, to still have some flaws at the end, even though they've overcome.
I think there's two types of flaws. There are flaws that are part of a person's growth process, and then there are flaws that are intrinsic to them that will never change. For instance, the monk character on TV, he's never going to overcome those anxieties because those are intrinsic to him. And so you use those to play off of. But even with Monk, they have certain trust issues and things like that where he has growth.
Bugs and features. Some things are a bug, but some things are a feature.
Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it.
Okay, well, thank you for your questions. Thanks to our panelists. Thank you for coming on.